John had never thought his day would turn out like this. He was just an ordinary guy, living in a quiet town, going about his usual routine. It was late in the afternoon, the sun beginning to set and casting a warm orange glow over the streets. John walked home from work, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his mind wandering over the usual thoughts. The world around him was calm and peaceful, the way he liked it. But as he passed by the edge of the forest near his house, something caught his eye. At first he thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a stray dog. But as he took a closer look, his heart skipped a beat. Lying on the ground, barely conscious, was a figure, a woman. She seemed out of place, her clothes tattered and her body covered in dirt. John felt a mix of fear and curiosity rush through him. She didn't look like anyone he had ever seen. Her skin had a strange, almost iridescent glow to it, and her long dark hair seemed to shimmer in the fading light. She looked both fragile and otherworldly, as though she didn't belong to this planet. John hesitated for a moment. His first instinct was to run, to ignore whatever it was he had just seen, but something inside him told him to stay, to help. He took a deep breath and carefully approached her, his footsteps cautious and slow. When he knelt beside her, he noticed that her breathing was shallow and her face looked pale, as if she had been through something terrible. "Are you okay?" John asked softly, though he wasn't sure if she could even understand him. She didn't respond. Her eyes were closed, and she appeared to be barely holding on to consciousness. He didn't know what to do, but he knew he couldn't just leave her there. John scanned the area around him. There was no one else in sight. He was alone, miles from the nearest house. The forest was quiet except for the distant rustling of leaves. As he looked back at the woman, a strange feeling washed over him. Something deep inside, like an instinct, told him this was important. This wasn't a random encounter. There was something about her that drew him in, something familiar, yet unexplainable. He quickly reached into his bag and pulled out a bottle of water he had been carrying. He gently lifted her head and offered her the water. At first, she didn't react, but then her fingers twitched and her lips parted slightly. She took a small sip, barely enough to keep her alive. As the water dripped from her lips, her eyes flickered open for the first time. John was taken aback by her eyes. They weren't human. They were a deep shade of silver, almost glowing in the dimming light. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just stared at each other, the silence between them heavy and thick. The woman seemed to be studying him as much as he was studying her. There was an unspoken understanding in that moment, but what it meant, neither of them could tell. "Who are you?" John asked, his voice trembling a little. He didn't know why he was asking. He wasn't sure she could even answer, but she didn't speak. Instead, she tried to sit up. Her body trembled, and John immediately placed a hand on her shoulder to steady her. "Hey, take it easy. You're still weak." Her eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, John felt a strange connection. It was as if they were communicating without words. He couldn't explain it, but something inside him told him that he had to take care of her. She wasn't just some random person. She needed help, and he was the one who had found her. John didn't know why, but he knew she wasn't from around here. Maybe it was the way she looked, or maybe it was the sense of calm yet unsettling presence she carried with her. Whatever it was, John knew she wasn't just an ordinary woman. After a mom. Ant of hesitation, John helped her to her feet. She stumbled slightly but managed to stay upright, leaning on him for support. I can take you to my house," he offered, unsure of what he was getting himself into. "It's just a short walk from here. You'll be safe there." The woman didn't protest. Instead, she gave him a nod, her silver eyes filled with a quiet, thankful gaze. John helped her walk back toward his home, the sun now almost completely set. The trees around them loomed tall and dark, the forest feeling even more mysterious in the fading light. John couldn't shake the feeling that something big was happening, something he couldn't understand. As they walked, he kept stealing glances at her. He was still so confused. Who was she? How had she ended up in the forest like this? And why did she seem so different, so not human? Questions flooded his mind, but he didn't ask any of them. He couldn't explain why, but he felt it wasn't the right time to ask. When they reached his house, John helped her inside. He guided her to the couch and offered her a blanket. He didn't know what else to do. She was clearly in no condition to talk, and there were too many questions swirling in his mind. John sat down in a chair across from her, staring at her with a mix of awe and disbelief. His life had just taken a strange turn, and he had no idea where it would lead. What did this woman want? Where had she come from? And most importantly, why had he been the one to find her? As the minutes ticked by, the house felt strangely quiet. It was as if the whole world had stopped, waiting for something to happen, and for the first time in his life, John felt like he was part of something much bigger than he could ever understand. The next morning, John awoke with a strange feeling lingering in the air. His bedroom was filled with the soft hum of the morning sun filtering through the curtains, but his mind was far from peaceful. He had spent most of the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the strange woman he had found in the forest. His mind raced with questions. Who was she? Where did she come from? And most of all, why had she appeared in his life? He got up from bed, stretched, and walked downstairs. His house, usually calm and quiet, felt different now. There was an odd energy that seemed to pulse through the air, especially in the living room, where the woman was resting. He had given her a place on the couch last night, where she had fallen into a deep, silent sleep the moment she laid down. She was still there now, though it was clear she had moved during the night. Her head was no longer resting on the pillow, and she was sitting upright, gazing out the window as the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees outside. John stood at the foot of the stairs watching her, unsure of what to do. He felt a strange pull to her, something he couldn't explain. It wasn't just physical attraction, though he couldn't deny that she was beautiful in a way he had never seen before. It was deeper than that, like an invisible thread had linked them together in some unexplainable way. He couldn't ignore it, and he didn't know if he wanted to. The woman's silver eyes turned toward him, meeting his gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stared at each other. John's heart pounded in his chest as her unblinking gaze seemed to pierce right through him, as if she could see into his very soul. "Good morning," John said, his voice tentative. His words felt strangely inadequate, as though nothing he could say would be enough to bridge the gap between them. It felt like he was speaking to someone who wasn't quite human, someone who existed in a different world. She didn't respond with words, but she gave a slight nod, her gaze softening. John noticed that her face had a calm, almost serene expression, as if she had come to terms with something inside her. It was strange to think that just a few hours ago she had been weak, barely able to move. Now she seemed stronger, more alive. There was something almost otherworldly about her presence, something that left him feeling both awestruck and cautious. "I'm John," he continued, trying to keep the conversation going, though he wasn't sure why. "You probably don't remember much, but you're safe now. I found you in the forest yesterday." The woman's eyes glimmered, and she tilted her head as though trying to understand his words. It was clear that she didn't speak English, at least not in the way he understood it. Yet there was a sense that she understood him on some level, a deeper connection that went beyond language. She slowly stood up from the couch, her movements graceful but deliberate. John instinctively stepped back, giving her space, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something that would change everything. The woman stretched her arms above her head, and as she did, John noticed something that made him freeze. There were faint glowing patterns etched into her skin, like tattoos, but they were unlike anything he had ever seen. They shimmered with a soft, ethereal light, almost as if they were alive. The glow pulsated with a rhythm that seemed to mirror the beating of his own heart. "Who are you?" John asked again, his voice more urgent this time. "Where are you from?" She looked at him, her silver eyes filled with a quiet intensity. Then, with a gentle motion, she held up her hand, palm facing him, and a strange energy seemed to radiate from her fingertips. John took an instinctive step backward, his heart racing. He could feel the air around her crackling, like static before a storm. And then, as if to reassure him, she lowered her hand and shook her head slowly. She didn't seem to be threatening him, but something told him that the energy she emitted was far more powerful than he could comprehend. John swallowed hard. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, more to hit Sean, himself than to her. "I'm not going to hurt you." The woman didn't respond verbally, but she gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. There was something warm in it, something that made him feel like she wasn't just some stranger from another world, but someone he was meant to meet. A bond was forming, and John couldn't deny it. He felt it pulling at him, urging him to trust her, to understand her in a way that went beyond words. She sat back down on the couch, folding her legs under her as though she was more at ease now. John hesitated before sitting down across from her. The room felt thick with unspoken questions and emotions. The silence was heavy, yet oddly comforting. Finally, the woman reached for the small piece of cloth she had used to cover her shoulders the night before. She began to carefully wrap it around her body, almost as though she was trying to hide something. John watched her, intrigued by the way she moved, so careful, so deliberate. But there was something in the way she did it, something that made him wonder if she was trying to protect herself, or maybe even something more. After a few moments of silence, John finally spoke again. "You're not from here, are you?" he asked gently, as if testing the waters. "You don't have to tell me everything right now, I just need to understand. Why did you come here? What do you want from me?" Her silver eyes met his once more, and this time there was something almost sad in her gaze. She looked down at her hands, then back at John, as if weighing her words carefully. And though no words left her mouth, John felt the answer in his chest, in the pit of his stomach. The bond between them was deeper than he had ever imagined. She wasn't just a stranger he had found in the forest. She was a part of something much bigger, a piece of a puzzle that John was somehow destined to help solve. And for reason. He couldn't explain. He felt like he had no choice but to help her. But there was something more. The longer they sat in silence, the stronger the feeling grew within him. He wasn't just helping her. In some strange, inexplicable way, she was already helping him. She had come into his life for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it was pulling them together in ways neither of them could fully understand. As the morning light streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the room, John realized that he was no longer alone. His life had changed forever, and whether he was ready for it or not, he was now a part of something much greater than anything he had ever known. The next few days passed in a blur. John couldn't shake the feeling that his life had been turned upside down. The woman, who still hadn't shared her name with him, was both a mystery and a constant presence in his home. She had grown stronger, her body healing quickly from the weakness she had shown when he first found her in the forest. It was as if her recovery was almost supernatural. Though they had no shared language, their bond deepened. John found himself spending hours in her company, trying to communicate through gestures, body language, and the occasional written note. She would often sit by the window, gazing out at the world beyond, as though watching for something or someone. The air around her always seemed charged with energy, and John couldn't help but feel a strange connection to her, like she was not just a woman from another world, but a force of nature. But it wasn't until one night that John began to truly understand the extent of her powers. It was late, the moon hanging low in the sky, casting a silvery glow across the living room. John had been sitting at his kitchen table working on some documents from his job when he heard a soft noise from the living room. It was like the air had shifted, growing thick and heavy with an unknown energy. He set his pen down and stood up, walking toward the source of the sound. The woman was standing by the window, her back turned to him. Her long, dark hair cascaded down her shoulders, and her form seemed to glow in the moonlight. There was a soft hum in the air, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make the hairs on the back of John's neck stand up. It wasn't the usual stillness of the house. This was different. There was something in the way the room felt, as though the world outside was stretching and warping. "Are you okay?" John asked, his voice cautious as he approached her. Without turning around, she held up a hand, and the air seemed to respond. The room flickered for a brief moment, and John's heart skipped a beat. The window in front of her shimmered, as though it were made of liquid glass. For a split second, the landscape outside seemed to distort, and then, to his astonishment, the view shifted. He wasn't looking at the quiet street outside anymore. Instead, he saw a distant cityscape, gleaming towers that stretched high into a sky unlike any he had ever seen. It was a futuristic metropolis, filled with structures that defied logic, floating in a sky illuminated by a strange, twin-sunned sun. The colors were otherworldly, and the air was filled with energy, a hum that resonated deep in his chest. John took a step back, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "What is that?" he whispered, his voice filled with awe and confusion. The woman's silver eyes slowly turned toward him, and for the first time she spoke, though her voice was soft and melodic, almost like a song. "My home. My world." John felt a shiver run down his spine. You're from there?" She nodded, her expression solemn. The shimmering view outside continued to pulse, showing flashes of other landscapes, forests filled with towering trees, vast oceans, and strange skies, each vision more alien and beautiful than the last. He realized, Zed with a shock, that these weren't just visions, they were real. They were fragments of her world, brought into his living room by some power she controlled effortlessly. "How are you doing this?" John asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Is this some kind of magic?" She shook her head slowly, her eyes distant as though remembering something painful. With a gesture, the vision outside the window began to fade, and the familiar sight of his quiet neighborhood returned. But the air around them felt different now, charged, alive. He could almost feel the pulse of the energy around them. "I am not human," she said simply, her voice quiet but filled with an undeniable strength. "What you saw is only a fraction of what I am capable of." John's mind was spinning. He had known she wasn't from Earth, but seeing her powers in action was something else entirely. He had never believed in anything supernatural, and yet here he was, standing in front of a being who could bend reality with nothing but her will. "Why are you here?" John asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from me?" The woman turned away, walking slowly toward the center of the room. The air seemed to thicken with each step she took, as if her presence alone was enough to shift the very fabric of the space around them. "I do not want anything from you," she said softly. "I was cast away. My world, my people, they no longer exist as they once did. I fled to this planet to escape, to hide, and you were the one who found me." John's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel her words settling into his mind, heavy and real. There was a sadness in her voice, a deep, unspoken sorrow that echoed in her eyes. She wasn't just lost, she was broken, haunted by a past that she couldn't escape. The more he listened to her, the more John understood that she wasn't just running from her enemies, she was running from herself. "You didn't just come here to hide," John said, his voice gentle. "You came because you needed help." She nodded, her eyes finally meeting his once more. "Yes, I need you. Not for what you can give me, but for what you are. You are a part of this, of my future." John felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't understand what she meant by that, but it was clear that whatever was happening between them wasn't a coincidence. This connection, this bond they were forming, it was far deeper than anything he had ever imagined. As if to prove her point, the room suddenly seemed to change again. The air around them vibrated, and for the briefest moment, John could feel the fabric of time itself bending. A ripple of energy pulsed through the walls, and the lights flickered as if responding to the strange power that surrounded them. John could hear her breathing softly, and before he could ask any more questions, she held out her hand. "This is what I can do," she said, her voice calm, but there was a weight behind her words. "And you are a part of it now." John hesitated for a moment, but something inside him urged him to take her hand. As his fingers brushed against hers, a surge of energy coursed through him, filling him with warmth, strength, and an overwhelming sense of connection. It was as if a door had opened inside him, one he didn't know existed. The power was not just hers, it was now shared between them. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," John admitted, his voice shaky. "I don't even know who you really are." She smiled softly, her silver eyes filled with understanding. "No one is ever ready, but together we will face what comes next." And in that moment, John realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The woman, this mysterious, powerful being, had come into his life for a reason, and whatever that reason was, he knew it would change everything, forever. The days that followed were filled with an uneasy quiet, the kind that settles in after something extraordinary has happened and you realize you are no longer the same person. John could feel it in the air. He was no longer just an ordinary man. The woman, with her mysterious origins and powerful abilities, had changed his life in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. Every time she walked into a room, it was as if the world itself shifted slightly to accommodate her presence. He could sense the weight of the untold story she carried, the burden of something much darker and more complicated than he could ever imagine. It was during one of their quiet evenings, as they sat in the living room, when John finally gathered the courage to ask her more about her past. He had tried before, but her reluctance to speak about herself was always clear. There were moments when her eyes would flicker with something, fear, grief, or something deeper, but she would quickly look away, as though shutting herself off from whatever memories threatened to overwhelm her. But tonight was different. John had been sitting on the couch, absent-mindedly flipping through a book, when he felt her presence beside him. She had a way of moving silently, almost like a shadow, but when she sat down next to him, he could feel the tension radiating from her. Her eyes, once bright with mystery, now seemed clouded with something else, something heavy. "I know you don't like to talk about it," John began softly, "but I need to understand what happened to you, to your people." She turned her head toward him, her silver eyes gleaming in the dim light of the room. For a long moment, she said nothing. The silence between them felt like an ocean, vast and unbridgeable. But John didn't turn away. He had to know. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and distant, as though she were speaking from a place far away. "My name is Lyra," she said, her words careful, as if testing the weight they would carry. "I am not from this world. I come from a place called Kylara, a planet that existed beyond the stars you know. It was beautiful, lush forests, vast oceans, ties that reached the skies. We were a people of great power, of knowledge beyond what your world can imagine." John's heart raced as he listened. She spoke with such reverence for her home, that it almost seemed like she was describing a dream. He could see the images in his mind, a world unlike Earth, filled with advanced technology and endless possibilities. But there was a darkness in her voice now, a sadness that John couldn't ignore. "Your people," John said slowly. "They're gone, aren't they?" Lyra nodded, her eyes darkening with the weight of memories. "Yes, gone." Her voice cracked ever so slightly, and John saw her hand tremble. It wasn't always this way. Kylara was once a thriving civilization, but our world, our people became consumed by their own desires, power, control. We had the ability to harness forces of nature, of space, of time itself. But we were reckless. We thought we were invincible. We thought we could control everything. John could feel the tension building between them as Lyra continued. The people of Kylara were divided into two factions. One sought to use our power to create peace and prosperity, while the other wanted to bend the universe itself to their will. The two factions warred for generations, but there was one leader who sought to end it all, one leader who promised to unite us, to end the fighting. His name was Orlan. John leaned forward, drawn deeper into her story. What happened to him, to Kylara? Lyra's eyes flickered with a haunted expression. Orlan was not just a leader. He was the most powerful of us all. His knowledge of the ancient forces, the hidden truths of the universe, was unparalleled. But when he tried to bring the two factions together, he discovered something terrible. John held his breath, sensing that Lyra was about to reveal something that would change everything. "He foe, and a secret," she continued, her voice low and pained. "A secret buried deep within the fabric of Kylara's history. Something that should never have been uncovered. It was a power far older than our civilization. A dark force, one that was beyond our control. And when Orlan tried to use it, the consequences were catastrophic." She paused, her eyes drifting away, as if she could still see the destruction in her mind. The entire planet. Kylara was destroyed. Orlan's actions tore apart the very core of our world. The cities crumbled, the oceans turned to dust, and the sky itself was ripped apart. My people, they perished, all of them. There was nothing left. John could hardly process her words. The scale of what she was describing was beyond anything he had ever imagined. He thought of Earth, of all the people he knew and loved, and how fragile their world felt. To lose an entire planet, an entire civilization, he couldn't fathom it. "But you," John's voice faltered as he looked at her. "You're still here. How did you survive?" Lyra's gaze turned inward, as if the question had brought her back to the painful moment she had tried so hard to bury. "I was one of the few who survived, though I should not have been," she whispered. "I was a member of the faction that sought peace. We had long ago realized the dangers of the power we wielded, but even I couldn't stop what happened. I tried to warn Orlan, to stop him from unlocking that ancient power, but it was too late. The destruction was already set in motion. When Kylara fell, I was cast away, banished to this world, far from what was left of my people." John's heart sank as the weight of her words hit him. She wasn't just a lost traveler from another world. She was the last of her kind, the last survivor of a civilization that had destroyed itself in the pursuit of too much power. "But how did you end up here?" John asked softly, his voice filled with sympathy. Lyra's eyes met his, and for the first time there was a sense of quiet resolve in them. "I fled. I was the only one who could escape, the only one who had the chance. I was exiled to the farthest reaches of the universe, sent away to a planet far from the destruction. I found this world by accident, or perhaps it found me, and when I arrived I was lost. For years I wandered, trying to forget what I had lost, but my enemies found me too, and they've been searching for me ever since." John's mind was reeling. He had always thought of space as just a vast, empty place, something distant and cold. But now it was personal. The universe was not just a place of stars and planets. It was filled with the same struggles, the same desires, and the same dangers as Earth. The room fell silent, the weight of her story pressing down on them both. John didn't know what to say, but he knew one thing for certain. Lyra wasn't just a stranger to him. She was the last of a people who had been destroyed by their own arrogance. And she had found him, not by accident, but because their fates were somehow intertwined. "Lyra," John said finally, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "You're not alone anymore. I don't know what comes next, but I'm not going to let you face this alone." For the first time, a genuine smile appeared on her lips, soft, bittersweet, but full of gratitude. "You don't know what you've just gotten yourself into," she said, her voice barely a whisper. And John realized with a sudden clarity that everything was about to change. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The silence in the room stretched for what felt like an eternity. John sat on the couch, his mind racing after hearing Lyra's painful story. The gravity of her words hung heavy in the air, and it was impossible to shake the sense of destiny that seemed to pull them together. Yet, even with that understanding, he couldn't help but feel a growing unease in his chest. What had begun as a strange encounter in the woods was quickly becoming a tangled web of fate, and John realized that no matter how much he tried to prepare, nothing could have prepared him for what was coming. Lyra, for the first time in days, seemed quiet. Her usual serene and calm demeanor had shifted. She stared at the floor, lost in thought, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. John's instinct told him that there was more she wasn't telling him, more to this dark past of hers that had yet to be revealed. But there was no way to know for sure. All he could do was wait. Hours passed and the night descended quietly upon the house. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards underfoot, and the rustle of the leaves outside were the only sounds breaking the stillness. Lyra had retreated to the small corner of the living room she had claimed as her own. John had tried to go about his evening as normal, doing some light chores and preparing a meal, though he couldn't stop thinking about the sudden weight on his shoulders. Then it happened. The moment John had been both dreading and anticipating. The air in the room shifted again, thick and heavy, almost suffocating. A low, vibrating hum filled the space, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He looked over at Lyra, who had risen to her feet, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. For the first time since their meeting, she looked unsettled, almost panicked. "What's happening?" John asked, his voice tight with concern. He stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. Something was wrong. He could feel it. Lyra's voice was barely above a whisper as she spoke, her gaze locked on the door. "They're here. They found me." John's stomach dropped. He had feared this moment, feared that her enemies, the ones who had been chasing her, would eventually catch up. He hadn't expected them to find her so soon, but in that moment, he realized that they weren't just threats from another world. They were real, and they were coming for. How?" he asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. "How could they have tracked you here?" Lyra's eyes flickered with something that John couldn't quite read. She turned to face him, her expression more serious than he had ever seen. "It was always only a matter of time. My enemies have been hunting me since I left Kylara. They are relentless. They know no mercy, and now, they found me." John could see that she was holding back something bigger than fear, something darker, but there was no time to press her for answers. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the floor and walls. John could feel it in his bones, a low-frequency wave that seemed to shake everything around them. It was as though the air itself was alive with tension, warning them of something approaching. Suddenly, the door burst open with a deafening crash. John spun around just in time to see two figures storm into the room. They were tall, almost inhumanly so, their dark armored figures silhouetted against the dim light. Their faces were obscured by helmets, but their presence was unmistakable. There was no mistaking who they were. These were the soldiers Lyra had spoken about, the ones who had followed her across the stars, the ones who would stop at nothing to capture her and drag her back to whatever nightmare she had fled. "Lyra!" one of the figures growled, its voice distorted and mechanical. "Come with us. You cannot hide from the Kylaran Empire." John's heart raced. His first instinct was to run, to escape, but Lyra's words echoed in his mind. "They found me." He glanced at Lyra, whose silver eyes were now filled with a deep, burning anger. She stood tall, her posture shifting, as though preparing for something far more dangerous than she had ever shown him before. Without a word, she raised her hand, and the room suddenly began to glow, the energy around them pulsing with an intensity that made the very air feel electric. The soldiers hesitated, their hands twitched toward their weapons, but there was a moment of uncertainty, just long enough for Lyra to act. In a blur of motion, she snapped her fingers. The ground beneath the soldiers cracked open, and they staggered backward as a deep fissure tore through the floor, glowing with a strange, alien energy. The hum in the room reached a deafening crescendo, and John watched in stunned silence as the soldiers struggled to maintain their footing. For a split second, it felt as though time itself had stopped, everything frozen in the chaotic energy she was unleashing. But then, everything shifted again. With a flick of her wrist, Lyra sent the soldiers flying back, their bodies crashing into the walls with bone-crushing force. The energy dissipated, and the room fell silent, save for the soldiers' ragged breathing. John stood there, wide-eyed, his mind struggling to catch up with what he had just witnessed. Lyra had done all of that. She had moved the earth itself with nothing but a gesture. She wasn't just a survivor of a fallen civilization. She was a force, a weapon. The soldiers groaned as they pulled themselves up, but it was clear they were no match for her power. They reached for their weapons, but Lyra wasn't finished. She raised her hand again, and this time the air around them began to shimmer, as though reality itself was warping. "Leave," Lyra commanded, her voice cold and filled with authority. "Leave this place, or I will show you why Kylara fell." For a moment, there was only the sound of their breath and the crackling tension in the air. The soldiers exchanged wary glances, clearly calculating their next move, but they knew the odds were against them. With a final furious glare, they turned and fled, disappearing into the night as quickly as they had arrived. The door slammed shut behind them, and the room fell back into silence. John looked at Lyra, his mind racing. He had just witnessed her power, her true power, and it was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. She had just defeated two of her most dangerous enemies without breaking a sweat, but the look in her eyes was one of regret, not triumph. "We can't stay here," Lyra said, her voice quiet but firm. "They will come again, and next time, they will bring more." John swallowed hard. The world he knew was falling apart, piece by piece. Everything had just changed. He was no longer just a bystander in this alien saga. He was a part of it, whether he liked it or not. But one thing was clear. He would stand by her side. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The quiet of the night had barely settled when the hum of distant engines began to disturb the calm air. John had barely begun to process what had happened, the sudden, terrifying appearance of the Kylaran soldiers and Lyra's overwhelming power, when the unmistakable sound of a low, mechanical thrum reached his ears. He glanced at Lyra, who stood by the window, her posture tense, her silver eyes scanning the horizon. The calm that had once been a comfort now felt heavy, suffocating, as if the air itself was waiting for something to break. Lyra's face was tight, her jaw clenched, and John could see the weight of everything, the past, the present, and whatever horrors were yet to come, pressing down on her. "They're coming again," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper, but there was no mistaking the fear in her tone. John felt his heart pound in his chest. He didn't need to ask who they were. The soldiers from the Kylaran Empire had already shown their power, and if they were back, it meant they weren't going to leave her alone. It was no longer just a chase. It was a battle. "How long until they get here?" John asked, trying to keep his voice steady, but the sense of dread gnawed at him. "Too soon," she answered, her voice tight with determination. "They know where I am. They found my trail, and now they won't stop until they have me. But this time," she turned to face him, her silver eyes glowing, with an intensity he hadn't seen before. "This time, I will not run. I will fight." John felt a rush of both fear and admiration. He had known that Lyra was powerful. She had shown him that when she dispatched the soldiers before, but he hadn't truly understood the full scope of her abilities. And now, it seemed as though the calm, distant woman he had been helping was no longer the same person. The weight of the universe pressed on her, and she was ready to face it head-on. He stepped closer to her, his own sense of resolve growing despite the fear twisting in his stomach. "I'm with you. Whatever happens, I won't leave." Her gaze softened for just a moment, but then, like a switch being flipped, her expression hardened again. "You don't know what you're asking. If they come here, they'll destroy everything." John had no answer for that, but he didn't back down. He knew that if he didn't stand by her now, there would be no going back. Whatever came next, whatever horrors awaited them, they would face it together. And just as the words left his mouth, the thrum of engines grew louder, closer. Lyra's eyes narrowed. "We don't have much time." John moved toward the door, instinctively grabbing a small, rusted crowbar from the corner of the room. It was a makeshift weapon, but it was all he had. He wasn't sure what he could do against soldiers who could move entire rooms with a thought, but he had to try. He couldn't just stand there and watch her fight alone. "Are they close?" he asked, turning back to Lyra. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she was at the window again, her fingers tracing the edges of the glass as she peered out into the night. Her face was tense, her mind working through 1,000 possibilities, no doubt formulating strategies and plans that John couldn't even begin to understand. The sound of the engines was unmistakable now, throaty and mechanical, like something straight out of a nightmare. John could hear them cutting through the night, growing louder with every second. Whatever was coming, it was fast. "They're here," Lyra said, her voice now cold and resolute. John's stomach twisted. The fear that had been gnawing at him now bubbled to the surface. He wanted to run, to hide, but he knew there was no escaping this. Not anymore. They would have to stand their ground and face whatever came. Lyra turned to him, her silver eyes locking onto his with an intensity that sent a shiver through him. You need to get to safety. I'll hold them off. John shook his head, stepping forward. I'm not going anywhere. You're not doing this alone. For a moment, Lyra's gaze softened, and John could see the conflict in her eyes. She had no doubt fought battles alone before, but for the first time, she seemed to hesitate. The woman who had been a stranger to him only days ago, the one with a past so full of pain, had become someone he cared about, and in that moment he couldn't bear the thought of her facing this alone. All right, she said, her voice softening, but stay out of the way when it gets ugly. Before John could respond, the door slammed open with a force that shook the entire house. The sudden gust of wind swept into the room, knocking a chair over. John barely had time to react before a group of soldiers stormed in, their dark figures silhouetted against the night. There were more of them this time, at least 5, each of them carrying high-tech weapons and wearing armored suits that gleamed under the dim light of the room. Lyra's eyes flashed, and without a word she raised her hand. The energy in the room shifted once again, growing thick and heavy, like the atmosphere was charged with static electricity. The soldiers didn't hesitate. They immediately aimed their weapons at her, the sharp hum of energy weapons charging. But Lyra was already moving. With a fluid motion, she swept her hand through the air, and the ground trembled. The floor beneath. The soldiers cracked, sending them stumbling backward as the house itself seemed to shudder. John felt a rush of wind, the air thick with raw power. He watched in awe as Lyra manipulated the space around them, bending it like it was made of rubber. She moved with precision, a force of nature, as though she were a storm given form. One soldier fired a blast of energy at her, but Lyra raised her other hand, and the blast stopped midair, suspended by her will. It hovered for a moment, crackling with energy, before she flung it back at the soldier with a flick of her wrist. The soldier was knocked off his feet, crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. John's eyes widened as he watched Lyra continue to fight, her movements fluid and powerful. She wasn't just defending herself, she was taking control, and every attack she launched was calculated and devastating. But as the battle raged on, John couldn't ignore the fear that lingered in the pit of his stomach. These soldiers were relentless, and though Lyra's power was immense, there was no telling how many more of them were out there. The sounds of their battle echoed through the house, and he realized just how quickly everything had escalated. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a war, and they had just stepped into the middle of it. The soldiers regrouped, their movements becoming more coordinated as they closed in on Lyra. John knew that this wasn't just an attack, it was a strategy. They were trying to corner her. With a sudden burst of energy, Lyra sent another wave of force crashing into the soldiers, sending 2 of them sprawling to the floor. But there were still more of them, and John could see that Lyra was beginning to tire. The raw energy she was expelling was taking its toll. "We need to finish this," John shouted, his heart racing as he looked around for something, anything that could help. Lyra turned to him, her expression fierce but strained. "Stay back," she ordered, but there was no mistaking the urgency in her voice. "This isn't over yet." The chaos of the battle raged on, the crackling energy from the soldiers' weapons clashing with the raw, primal force that Lyra summoned from the depths of her being. The air was thick with tension, charged with the intensity of the fight. John stood at the edge of the room, watching in awe and fear as Lyra took on the soldiers, her movements a blur of strength and power. He had never seen anyone move like this, so effortlessly, so fluid. But even as he admired her power, he knew that she couldn't keep this up forever. Lyra was starting to slow, sweat beaded on her forehead, and her breaths came in short, ragged gasps. She was exhausted, and it was becoming more and more apparent that she couldn't keep fending off the soldiers indefinitely. John could see it in her eyes, the fierce determination, the will to fight, but also the exhaustion that had begun to wear her down. Despite her powers, Lyra was still human, or at least something close to it. She could only push herself so far before the toll of the battle caught up with her. The soldiers regrouped again, their eyes cold and calculating. John could see the fear in their movements now. They knew they were facing something extraordinary, something they hadn't expected. But that didn't mean they would give up easily. They were relentless. The moment they saw weakness, they would strike. The tension in the room grew unbearable. John's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the stakes were higher than ever. They couldn't keep running from this. Lyra had known that from the start. But it wasn't just her battle anymore. He had been drawn into this conflict, whether he liked it or not. And now, standing on the edge of the battlefield, John knew that his choices would would define the future. "Lyra," he shouted over the noise of the skirmish, his voice urgent. "You have to stop. You're going to wear yourself out." She didn't respond immediately, too focused on the soldiers in front of her. But then, as if she heard him, her gaze shifted toward him. There was something in her eyes, something softer, something deeper than the fierce warrior she had become in the past few minutes. But there was also something else, something that cut through the weight of the moment, a sense of defeat. "I can't keep doing this, John," she said, her voice quieter now, strained. "They'll keep coming, and I'll only keep hurting you." John shook his head. "No, you're not going to hurt me. But we can't keep running from this. You've done more than enough. It's time for us to fight together." For the first time since this nightmare had begun, Lyra's eyes softened. She looked at him, really looked at him, as if seeing him in a new light. The energy in the room seemed to shift, and the air grew thick with the realization that their fates had already become intertwined in ways neither of them could have imagined. The soldiers advanced again, but this time John stepped forward, his heart pounding but his resolve growing stronger. He couldn't let Lyra do this alone. They had been through so much together already. There was no going back now. With a deep breath, John did something he never thought he would do. He raised the crowbar he had grabbed earlier and swung it in the direction of the soldiers. It was a simple, desperate gesture, but in that moment, it felt like the only thing he could do. He wasn't a soldier, wasn't trained to fight like Lyra, but he was standing beside her, and that was enough. The soldiers turned to him, their weapons aimed at him in an instant, but before they could fire, Lyra moved. She was at his side in an instant, her hand gripping his arm with surprising gentleness. "Stay behind me," she whispered, her voice steady despite the chaos. "I will handle this." John didn't argue. He stood behind her, watching as she stepped forward, her silver eyes glowing with determination. The energy in the room intensified once more, the very walls of the house vibrating with the power she was channeling. But this time it wasn't just her power, it was theirs. They were connected now, more than just allies. They were partners in this fight. "Leave," Lyra said, her voice clear and commanding. "This is your last chance. Go now, and I will let you live. I will not show mercy again." The soldiers hesitated, clearly taken aback by her words. They had never encountered anyone like her before, someone who could wield such power so effortlessly. They weren't sure how to react, but they knew one thing. They were in over their heads. One of them raised a hand, signaling the others to stop. "We cannot retreat," the soldier's voice crackled through the helmet. "Our orders are clear." Lyra's eyes narrowed, and John could see the shift in her expression. The calm that had once defined her was gone, replaced by something colder, something more dangerous. She wasn't just protecting herself anymore, she was protecting them both. With a swift motion, Lyra reached out and unleashed a blast of energy so powerful that it sent the soldiers flying backward. The force of the blast shattered the windows, the glass raining down like hail. For a brief moment, the entire room was filled with a blinding light, and John had to shield his eyes. The soldiers were thrown back, their armor crumpling under the weight of the energy. The battle was over before it had even fully begun. Lyra stood in the center of the room, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The soldiers, now scattered and defeated, were no longer a threat. The room was silent, save for the distant sound of the wind outside. John stepped forward, his mind still racing. He had never imagined anything like Turret's on. His in his life, the power, the danger, the intensity, it was all too much to process. But somehow, he felt a sense of finality. This was it. There was no going back. Lyra turned to him, her silver eyes meeting his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them was filled with everything they had been through, the shared moments, the unspoken understanding, and the connection that had grown between them. "You did it," John said softly, his voice filled with awe. Lyra's expression softened, but there was a trace of sadness in her eyes. "I did it for us both," she replied. "But this isn't over. The Kyleran Empire won't stop until they find me." John nodded. "Then we fight. Together." A small, almost imperceptible smile touched Lyra's lips. "Together," she repeated. And in that moment, John understood. The world he had known, the quiet life he had lived, was gone. But in its place, a new future had begun to unfold, one filled with danger, uncertainty, but also an unshakable bond between him and Lyra. Whatever came next, they would face it together, and no matter what the universe threw their way, they would fight, for survival, for each other, and for the future they would create.